Right, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to Maeve and to Chris. It's been a pleasure to come to Dublin. So I guess my mic is actually only for the camera. I'll try to project. I've got a bit of a cold. So my title, Atoning for the Presumption to Hold Office, this comes from Seamus Heaney's poem, The Republic of Conscience. There are two lines in it that I'd like to quote. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep to atone for their presumption to hold office. And I'd like to think about these lines not only in relation to public leaders, politicians, but in relation to all public service providers, all public servants and professionals who hold the interests of many people in their hands. And indeed, this list of such people, it includes not only doctors, nurses, teachers, prosecutors, judges, police officers, even bankers, farmers, CEOs. It also includes the role of citizen. As citizens, we hold people's interests in our hands in our decisions to participate politically or not, in the decision to stand for office, to campaign, to participate in town halls. That too is a form of public position. Now, I think in assuming an office, we don't necessarily have something to atone for, but we do have something to be sensitive to and respectful of, and that is the presumption that we can tread near the edge, that we can carry people's interests in our hands and hang on to our integrity, that we can presume to act on people's behalf and do so with integrity. And that takes a certain degree of humility, and I think that's what we have to be sensitive to. And I think many public servants and professionals are very sensitive to that. They do try to act with integrity and with conscience, and it's in the name of those things that some people refuse to provide services when instructed to do so, refuse to withhold services when instructed to do so. It's in the name of it that some people openly disobey or even covertly disobey, engage in forms of subterfuge. And it's in the name of integrity and conscience that some people blow the whistle on colleagues and institutional practices. And I'll just give you a list of examples, and this is a very varied list, but these are the ones that have been in the news fairly recently. So the pharmacist who refuses to dispense emergency contraceptive pills, the doctor who refuses to provide abortions, or the doctor who refuses to give reproductive advice to gay couples, the doctors and nurses who refuse to stop treatment for terminally ill patients, or indeed the doctors and nurses who refuse to provide costly treatment to terminally ill patients, the civil registrar who refuses to administer same-sex partnership ceremonies, the judge who engages in judicial subterfuge by covertly breaking the law and knowingly misrepresenting the content of the law so as to achieve a certain result, the teachers' union that engages in an illegal strike once they've been ordered back to work, the doctors who help people to avoid a draft call by deeming them to be unfit, the doctors who recuse themselves from overseeing an execution by lethal injection, the intelligence community analyst who exposes mass surveillance programs, the Defense Department employee who exposes secret documents on a war that contradict the public statements. So there's a very varied group of people here. And I would think every one of these people, or many of these people, representative parties would see this as acting with integrity and acting with conscience. But that obviously doesn't follow. That just believing you have conscience, believing you are animated by it, does not mean you are. Conscience, in my view, it's not the voice of God, it's not infallible moral guidance, but it is genuine moral sensitivity and responsiveness. The reason it's not the voice of God is because morality is very complex. There's a plurality of genuine moral values. They can't all coexist happily with each other. But conscience makes us sensitive to our genuine moral responsibilities. And it requires a degree of inner knowledge of your own mind and heart. I'm very interested in work that's being done outside philosophy, work that's being done in contemplative neuroscience, which suggests that people who do try to cultivate certain attitudes and dimensions of conscience, certain virtues, kindness, generosity, compassion, gratitude, mindfulness, that they have a more accurate picture of how their own minds and bodies are functioning, and more accurate perceptions, more accurate memories, and more accurate perceptions of how other people are experiencing the world. At least that's the evidence from the contemplative neuroscience perspective. And so what this picture of conscience indicates is that it's not something you can invoke. You can't simply assert that you are acting on conscience. Conscience is something you cultivate. It's probably a lifelong project. And you can't stand on it as a protection against regulation or reproof. Now what I want to do today, I want to draw together some strands of thought that I've developed over the last few years, and I apologize in advance. This does come from published work, so if you happen to have read some of my things, I apologize, this will be familiar. I want to do two things. I want to distinguish those examples of officials' nonconformity that are animated by conviction, and even meeting the standard of conscientious conviction is more demanding than we might think. I want to distinguish those from the ones that are animated by genuine conscience. And I want to show that we have good reason to be very tolerant of the first, and even more so, very good reasons to be respectful and protective of the second. We have very good reason to be friendly to the idea that office holders will engage in conscience-driven disobedience. And the second part is to show as a result of that the best way to atone for the presumption to hold office is not to adhere to the formal rules of the office, but to exercise our best first-order moral reasoning, to endeavor to cultivate conscience, and to be willing to engage in nonconformity when that's necessary to stand against injustice. Okay, so I'll start by saying what I think it takes to have a conscientious moral conviction. In my view, this is a sincere and serious, though possibly mistaken, moral commitment. And it takes four things. The first is consistency. The second is universal judgment. The third is non-evasion. And the fourth is dialogic effort. Now I'll say a bit about each of them, but together they comprise what I call the communicative principle of conscientiousness. So to give a little summary of what they look like as a package, when we judge some conduct to be seriously wrong, we must not only avoid engaging in that conduct ourselves, as well as we can, and judge such conduct by others to be, at least pro tanto, wrong, we also must be willing to bear the risks of honoring our conviction, and we must be willing to try to engage others in a dialogue about its merits. And an idea that really animated my thinking about this came from Anthony Duff, who he's written a very influential book on punishment, and he argues there for different purposes that when we remain silent in the face of something that we think is wrong, this casts doubt on the sincerity of our conviction that it is wrong. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about each of those four conditions. I'll give an example of each of them. So consistency. If a doctor thinks that it's wrong to provide abortions or wrong to give reproductive advice to gay couples, then other things being equal, she should avoid providing these services. Universal judgment. If a pharmacist judges that it's wrong to dispense emergency contraceptive pills, he must judge that it's pro tanto wrong not only for him to do it, for people of his religious or ethical persuasion to do it, but for anybody to dispense emergency contraceptive pills. Now I've built in a little sort of get out free clause there, that it is a pro tanto wrong, that additional considerations have to be taken into account before he need conclude that it's all things considered wrong for him or anyone else to do this. There might be overriding reasons in some cases. Non-evasion, and this feature of my view, this is where I get some pushback. In my view, you consistently do not evade the potential costs of holding a belief. That signals that you're neither inconsistent nor hypocritical. You're willing to be seen. You're willing to stand up for your belief. So someone like Edward Snowden willingly exposed himself to considerable personal risk when he leaked information about NSA and GCHQ programs, and he did so non-evasively by revealing himself as the source of the leaks. And then dialogic effort. A person must be willing to communicate to others the nature of their conviction, and other things being equal, this shows that the person believes the conviction is sufficiently credible that it can be given a reasoned defense, and that she's sufficiently committed to it that she thinks it's worth defending despite the personal risks. And again, Edward Snowden, I think, is a good example here. He said he acted with the aim, and he certainly achieved the effect of initiating a public debate about the legitimacy of GCHQ and NSA surveillance programs. Now, the dialogic condition needs to be broadly sensitive to a person's position. Some people are much more vulnerable than other people. Some views are much more unpopular than other views. And some views, if expressed certainly in a very open, transparent, self-exposing way initially, will undermine any attempt to continue a dialogue. They'll be self-defeating. And I think one example might be judicial subterfuge, that if a judge were openly to acknowledge that she's misrepresenting the law or she's changing the law through a judgment, she wouldn't hold on to her position for very long. So in order to even engage in this type of nonconformity, it has to, at least at that time, to be covert. Later down the line, she might hope to be able to give reasons, though probably not when she's practicing anymore. Okay, so that's my picture of conscientious conviction, and it's quite a demanding standard, even to have, you might then be mistaken about the morality of your conviction, but you have to at least pass these tests to be sincere and serious about it. And what comes out of these four conditions is that the nonconformity, the disobedience, the protest, the whistleblowing that might flow from them will in general be very constrained. And that's because someone who satisfies these four conditions will realize there are very good reasons not to be too radical in her choice of behavior. There's three reasons for that. The first is that the appeal of our dialogic effort will be drowned out if it comes with overly forceful tactics. Second, that appeal rests in part on treating our audience as interlocutors with whom we can have a rational moral discussion. And third, I think this is maybe the most important, we realize that we might be mistaken in our views, and therefore we use as much restraint as we can to show that we bear this in mind. And so this last feature is a signal of the humility that's needed in presuming to act for the sake of others' interests. It's one way of atoning or taking seriously that presumption to act for others. So when we take a principled stance for or against the formal expectations of our office, we have to be sensitive to the fact we might get it wrong. Now, I want to argue that when office holders do get it wrong, there are good reasons to be tolerant of that, to be accommodating if possible. And I've got three arguments for it, and they all feed into the case I want to make later about why we should be respectful and protective of conscience-driven disobedience. So the three arguments to tolerate mistaken acts of conscientious nonconformity are: first, respect for autonomy; a second, a concern about the psychological costs, the motivational costs, and the erosion of judgment that can come from intolerance; and third, the potential negative effects for the community of being intolerant. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about each of those. So first, a respect for autonomy, a respect for office holders' autonomy, people who are part authors of their own life. You can sort of pick your account of autonomy. I don't think it really matters how rich or how modest a view of autonomy you have. The thought is that if a person is asked always to sacrifice her deepest convictions in order to follow formal expectations, that puts an overly demanding pressure on her. It puts a disproportionate emphasis on conformity at the expense of personal autonomy. We are reasoning, feeling beings who are capable of forming very deep commitments, and one way of humanistic respect for that will give us some space not to conform. So when pressed, a doctor who has a conscientious, so meets the four tests, a conscientious position against giving reproductive advice to gay couples, could point to her convictions, point to her beliefs about why she holds this, beliefs about the social barriers to raising children in same-sex families, mistaken beliefs perhaps about how children fare, other perhaps less defensible grounds to excuse her refusal. She's not able to justify it, but she's able to give reasons for why she believes she has reason to act as she did. So that's the first thought, that respect for autonomy, respect for a person's efforts to lead her life according to her beliefs. Second, psychological costliness and akrasia, motivational costliness. There's both non-instrumental and instrumental sides to this point. The non-instrumental point is that there's an importance, a psychological importance distinct from autonomy in not always requiring us to put conformity with formal norms first. So there are risks of self-alienation, incongruity, motivational struggle that will dog any absolute expectations that we put formal expectations above personal conviction. And if we value autonomy, we have to value the underlying psychological conditions for autonomy, which include a broadly integrated mind and the capacity for practical reasoning. In instrumental terms, this idea about psychological costs, motivational costs, this reflects the Aristotelian interest in our desire, the importance of taking responsibility for who we are, basic responsibility. And unless we're given some opportunities to cultivate the skills of practical reason, to exercise good judgment, to make some decisions and exercise our will, we may be less able and less motivated to take responsibility for our conduct. And that would have very negative repercussions for public life. And so that leads into the third ground, risks for public life, public service, if there isn't toleration for officials to get it wrong sometimes when they don't conform. Okay, so in public office holding, and here's some thoughts on risks. In public office holding, particularly institutions where people's lives hang in the balance, so in healthcare, in the military, the risks of being intolerant are quite vivid. So I'll focus on healthcare for a moment. If you require professionals to provide services against their conscientious convictions, that poses risks for the patients, obviously. One risk is that of poor service. And that's particularly significant when the service requires special skill or is vital. The coerced health provider may provide the service less than satisfactorily, or if satisfactorily, less well than she would do according to her own understanding of her standards. And therein lies a risk for her, the provider, and that's the erosion of her confidence in her professionalism. A second risk to the service receiver, to the healthcare patient, is that of sabotage, that a professional who's given no scope to recuse herself may try to thwart the process, to prevent the person from receiving the service at all, not just from her. More generally, intolerance of conscientious nonconformity creates the risk of a general decrease in office holders' respect for formal norms, for the good norms, as well as the norms they disagree with. And so the general thought is that lack of tolerance for mistaken conscientious nonconformity will make it increasingly difficult for a person to follow the norms she ought to follow. And in a well-functioning system, we want our officials, we want office holders to maintain the will, the commitment, the capacity for general abidance, and the capacity to exercise practical judgment. Now, I'll just say one point about, I've emphasized service receivers' vulnerability as indeed a reason to be tolerant of refusals, but that's a double-edged sword because patients' vulnerability, service receivers' vulnerability, that's also a reason not to be tolerant of providers who want to refuse. And the reason is that if a patient is refused a service, she may think that she doesn't need the service or she doesn't have the right to ask for the service, and so we might want to insist on providers securing it even if they don't want to. Now, I think the answer to that is some of that vulnerability is contingent. If you set up the system so that the provider doesn't have to confront the receiver directly with her refusal, then the receiver is a bit more protected. So, if a provider doesn't want to provide a prescription for an emergency contraceptive pill, if the system is centralized, that you don't have to go and ask this doctor or this nurse who says no, but rather you're directed to someone who will do it, then the patient will be less vulnerable. Okay, so those three reasons to accommodate nonconformity that's conscientious but mistaken, they feed into the very good reasons we have to be respectful and protective of genuine conscience-driven nonconformity. Places where you are challenging an injustice, you're trying to rectify an injustice through the nonconformity. And here I think there's sort of two problems. One sort of this worry about sort of vigilantism, or that the lack of deference to the formal rules, and the other is worry about how do we tell? How do we tell if this is just an instance of conviction? How do we tell if this is an instance of conscience? And so I'll look at both of those. So one might think that the way you atone for the presumption to hold office is you try to be highly deferential to the rules. You follow the code book. You don't presume to judge how best to combat injustice. And there's a nice quote from Edmund Burke, which is sort of a response to this, which is that your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment. And he betrays, instead of serving you, if he sacrifices it to your opinion. So the thought being that a public officer does not do you a service in failing to exercise first order moral reasoning. You have a duty as an office holder not to allow the judgment and the mind to become dulled, not to allow the energy to combat injustice to become dulled. And I'll give an example. It's an example I use in my book it's about community support officers in the UK. There was a case a few years ago where there was a boy who was drowning in a pond, and some community support police officers saw this, and they did not attempt a rescue. Instead, they followed proper procedure, which was to radio for a trained crew to come to the scene. And of course, in the interim, the boy died. And they were praised by their superior for following proper procedure, but they were condemned in the media and UK discussions, and indeed by former Home Secretary David Blunkett, who said what was appropriate in this circumstance for a uniformed officer would have been appropriate for CSOs, community support officers, as human beings, never mind the job. And I put the point slightly differently, that in addition to being human beings who should be animated by this emergency, CSOs, community support officers, have special moral responsibilities. There is a moral role underpinning that office. And so when deciding how to act, they should have considered not the rule book, but their responsibilities to best protect the members of their community. And in my view, conscience, the hard work of cultivating practical moral skill, that enables us to be sensitive to our special moral responsibilities. It makes us willing to privilege them before formal expectations, even though this can be personally costly and can mean breaking the law. Now, how do we tell? How do we tell that this is a case of conscience and not just a case of personal conviction? And my answer there, it's a starting point answer, it's a minimal answer, is that we look to non-contingent basic needs. We look to the domain of necessity. And I think that would have made the answer quite transparent in the case of the child drowning in the pond. It's sort of the fundamental basic need that someone attempt to rescue a drowning child. It's as basic as it gets. Even if that's at the potential risk of your own life, that is what is required if you take your moral responsibility seriously. Our non-contingent basic needs and rights, they're not restricted just to physical threats and the risk of loss of life. They do include the brute necessities for survival, such as water, food, shelter, basic security, human companionship. But they also include fundamental humanistic needs. We aren't just brute creatures. Human beings are necessarily social creatures. We have fundamental needs for social inclusion, for basic legal and political recognition, for protection of our reasoning abilities, our expressive agency, and we have a need for basic respect. And so when we when we cultivate a degree of conscience, these will be amongst some of the things that should animate us to be willing not to conform with formal expectations of our office. And I'll finish with two concrete examples where I think office holders got it right or would get it right in not conforming to the rules of their office. And in a way, they're sort of too obvious. There's not much that's controversial here, at least not to my mind. So in The Guardian in August of this year, Dr. Mark Stern, who's a doctor based in Washington in the States, the title of his article was, "I was told to approve a lethal injection, but it violates my basic medical ethics." He said that in 2008, prison officials asked healthcare professionals under his supervision to procure the drugs for the lethal injection of a citizen at Washington's Walla Walla State Prison. The man's name was Darrell Ray Stenson. And the prison asked for these drugs to be provided, even though the healthcare department staff had assured them that they would not assist in any way with the execution. And Mark Stern, who was the supervisor, he learned about this drug procurement a week before the scheduled execution. He said, "It became clear to me, healthcare professionals cannot ethically participate in executions. Procurement of the drugs was a direct violation of the ethics of the personnel involved, but it was also a violation of medical ethics by me indirectly as their supervisor." And the next thing he says, I think he gets it wrong. He says, "This kind of violation could be cured if lethal injection drugs were returned to the pharmacy stores and obtained through a different source." I'll comment on that in a moment. He says, "But the prison authorities refused. The only cure remaining," he said, "was for me to recuse myself. My resignation took effect 3 days prior to the execution, and even though he says Stenson's execution was then stayed, and he actually got a new trial, and he's still in Walla Walla prison, and there's a moratorium on executions now in Washington." Now, I think Dr. Mark Stern was right to recuse himself. Overseeing executions deeply conflicts with the special moral responsibilities of doctors as healers and carers, but he was wrong to say the solution lies in getting the drugs from a different source or having someone else be trained as an overseer of executions. And that's because such a job is an excessively morally burdensome one. It doesn't satisfy what I would call a minimum moral burdens principle, that when society sets up offices to deal with its big problems, it has to ensure to the best of its ability that they place minimal or as minimal a moral burden on the office holder as possible. And someone whose office was to oversee lethal execution, to provide medical expertise to oversee that was their professional function, that would be an excessively morally burdensome one. The second example comes from Jeff McMahon, who has proposed that the US military adopt legal provisions so that active duty soldiers can selectively, conscientiously object when they believe a war is unjust. And his proposal is not that the military would be agnostic about the soldiers' reasons. So it's not like the kind of right to conscientiously refuse on the grounds of personal belief or religion, that there's sort of a stepping back and not a judgment made about the person's the credibility of the reasons for refusing. Here he says there would be a test for the plausibility of the soldiers' reasoning. They would have to show that they had good reasons to think this was an unjust war. And so in effect what McMahon's proposing, he doesn't give it this language, but this is I think what he's saying, is that soldiers should have a legal duty to refuse to fight in unjust wars. And that would track a moral duty to refuse to fight in unjust wars. And there too, I think, that would be a conscience-driven refusal to conform with the formal expectations of the office. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. Question?
I have a quick preliminary question. When you put in the requirement of engaging in dialogical discussion. Does that mean that a conscientious refusal based purely upon religion would require a proselytizing spirit, or would the requirement of it being reasoned debate mean that even if the person who's governed entirely by belief in what God told her, or the gods told her, that in that case, even if she's willing to proselytize for her God, she still would not be engaging in reasoned debate, and therefore it's outside the realm of what
of conscious conviction. So I would want to distinguish those religious-based acts of disobedience that are ritualistic from, so in the sense that someone would be thinking, other people are not wrong not to do this. So this person would not meet the universal judgment condition. It would be, if you're a member of my community, this is something you do as part of that community, but it's not morally wrong not to do it. Does that make sense?
The gods tell those of us who believe in them not to do it, but the gods are indifferent whether the other people do them?
I guess so. So there are ritual practices in many religious communities that it's not seen as you have sort of fundamentally violated a moral commandment in not doing it or not doing it. It's just, we in this community, this is something we do ritualistically. So if society doesn't let you do that, sort of the wearing, there's big debates in the UK and Europe about what you're allowed to wear or not wear. So, wearing a cross, wearing a headscarf, and though that one I think sort of starts to tread into what's morally acceptable for women to do. But that, that aesthetic act, it's a ritual. It's not that other people are wrong if they don't wear that symbol. So that kind of nonconformity, I wouldn't try to put, you have to be engaging in people in a discussion like this. You have to do it non-evasively. It's sort of outside the domain of conscientious moral conviction, in my view. Right. Okay. So yeah. So the other kinds of sort of private nonconformity based on personal belief, there, I maybe want to be a bit more sensitive than I have in the past to what that means for someone to do that. But if there's no attempt to engage others in reflection on why this should be legally protected, why this should be accommodated, why we should not have to do this covertly, then I do start to wonder how sincerely attached someone is to that practice. So if you're under existential threat, if practicing your religion is going to really make you a potential victim in society, then we might say, okay, that's sort of the boundary of what we would expect in terms of a dialogic effort. But if you're being surreptitious, if you're adjusting the practice so you won't be detected, if there's more emphasis on social self-preservation or economic self-preservation than there is on honoring this thing you believe is morally required, then I think we can start to doubt your sincerity.
I guess I'm confused a little bit. A lot of the conscientious objection to abortion and birth control, for example, is primarily religious.
Yeah.
And it's often couched in terms of morals, a broader universal, but that if you go down underneath, it's not turtles all the way down. At some point, it is a matter of the religious belief that life begins at conception, or life begins at when the egg is formed, or whenever.
Right. So I would say, the doctors who are openly refusing to provide them, who are trying to convince others that their hospitals should not be, allowing the practice, they would meet the standards, provided the other tests are met, they would meet the standards of conscientious conviction.
Even if the conviction, the effort to convince others requires a religious conversion of those people. If it's at base, it's religious.
So I think that sort of what makes it a moral requirement is outside of my discussion. So the fact, if it comes from God, if it comes from sort of a Kantian account of respect for persons, sort of whatever makes it in your view a fundamental moral requirement that we do this, that's not relevant. It's whether you think it's a universal moral requirement.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Robin.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for this very interesting the presentation. I have two questions. One is more theoretical and the other one maybe more practical. So the more theoretical concerns what you call the constraints on disobedience and the good reasons for not being too radical. I mean, so I'm interested in under which conditions are these constraints operative and what kinds of reasons are you thinking about here? I can imagine many conditions under which it seems unfair to one-sidedly burden those who disobey with these constraints. So imagine, the situation that the civil rights movement found itself in the United States, where there was a persistent refusal of the institutions and, to engage in any kind of dialogical effort. There was no interest in a rational moral discussion, and there was for sure no tribalism on the right, on the side of the status quo. So under these conditions, it seems unfair to say that you shouldn't be too radical because otherwise you might decrease the possibility of rational dialogue, etc. And Martin Luther King makes that very clear in his famous letter that that's just not an adequate criticism of their approach. Now one could still say he was still pretty constrained, obviously, and now I think the reasons for that are not. So the first question is: do these constraints do they only come into force when the other side is also fulfilling these criteria? And the second question is, if that is not the case, are there still reasons for constraint? And if so, are these reasons moral or are they just strategic or prudential? So I can see that Martin Luther King in many cases opted for a very constrained approach, but I think, in contrary to popular understanding, it's often not for moral reasons, but for strategic reasons, that he, for example, didn't evade punishment for the legal enforcement authorities. I don't think he was under any moral obligation to not do so. So that's the first question. The second question, the more practical one, I thought that maybe an exemplary case of attending to the non-contingent needs and then thinking about what that means for people who hold offices in contemporary Europe seem to be irregular migrants. So they are in a situation in which they are much more vulnerable, obviously, than most other people in terms of how even very, very basic needs are being fulfilled. And I was wondering whether an implication of your approach would be to say that people in schools, medical institutions, social services, but even the police are actually have a moral obligation, maybe even, to not report them, for example, to the relevant authorities, but rather attend to these non-contingent needs. I think that's the normatively right conclusion, but it then really drives a wedge into our understanding of the state, because it would mean that the state's officials are under an obligation not to enforce the state's claim to authority to control, who can be here, with what status, etc. So in this case, is it imaginable that, what would be the consequence of putting this into practice? It might just mean that migration policies will. Possible. I won't agree with that conclusion, but I'm just wondering.
No, that's great. Thank you. Well, I think in breaking the law, with respect to your first question of not being too radical, what does that mean on the ground? In breaking the law, you are, in many eyes, doing something that's already quite radical. So I think the interesting question is looking at not just what does the act appear to be, but what are the ramifications of a certain type of act. So, but then not to overthink that too much. So someone like Edward Snowden, the song coming from the U.S. government afterward was that this was devastating. This was he'd done so much damage to U.S. integrity or U.S. security, that the national interests of the U.S. were being jeopardized, and so that's something to think about, but obviously not to take their word for it on how serious his acts were, especially when there were other things they said to the effect that the diplomatic effect was, Susan Rice said there was very, very little diplomatic repercussions for the U.S. in the exposure of these programs. Same too with Rosa Parks. Sort of at first glance, there's something very modest about sitting in a bus seat, sitting where you're not permitted to sit. And then the next question is how much of the ramifications of that, subsequent anger and animosity and sort of increased violence toward black people, or sort of the ensuing boycott, how much of that should be attributed to her and that particular act that triggered in the broader. It was a planned act. It was part of a movement. So I think there's a difference between what acts that can appear to be radical because they sort of force radical reflection, and acts that are in themselves threatening. So in Montreal, the year before last, there were a series of protests related to student fees, and a lot of the protests then became around the government's very draconian responses to these protests. You can't protest within 50 feet of a university building. You can't have more than this many people in this. You can't protest after this hour. Like really, and so there's this big backlash. But some of that involved car burning, and window breaking, and it sort of lost its civility. People were wearing masks on the protests, and some of that might be because the police were responding in very harsh ways, but that is the kind of lack of restraint that I had in mind. With respect to being restrained as a strategic decision rather than a moral decision, I think that's often right, that is a reason for being restrained, and in a way a good reason for being restrained. And it can be an instrumental reason that informs a moral one. You are more likely to leave some room for your society to reflect on your cause if you don't sort of force the hand of the police or the judges, or that you're in being as civil as possible, you are supporting the potential for dialogue. With respect to your second point on irregular migrants, it's a really nice question whether schools, doctors, police should not be reporting, but instead supporting people, and whether this raises the question of the state's officials not enforcing the state's authority. And the example that comes to mind is from Australia. There was a judge a couple of years ago. She had two Thai girls who had sought who were trying to immigrate into Australia, and she was very sympathetic to their situation, but there was no space within what she could do legally to allow them to stay. And so, but she knew for herself she wasn't going to order a deportation. So she told the people who had brought the case that you have to go back. I need this information. I need that information. I need like a really nice long shopping list of things she needed to know before she was willing to, and sort of in doing that sent a signal. I'm not going to deport them, and so they didn't bring the case again. So she never got her shopping list, but she didn't have to face the question. And so I think there's a difference between you have to tread a very fine line as a state official, because yes, overall, if it's a good system, reasonably just system, we want it to continue functioning, and people to have faith in our officers and faith in the system. But I don't see police or doctors or school teachers individually helping irregular migrants to meet their basic needs as undermining the system as a whole. So I think there's room for both.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my head is still spinning from our conversation about Hegel. So I've been constructing a conversation between Professor Brownlee and Professor Hegel. So this is what I've done, just very briefly. So I think we have two very powerful responses to him, right? So one thing would be to say, look, there is a way by which conscientious action can be much more rigorous. We can avoid the dangers of subjectivism. One meets the tests that you've laid out, I think, very effectively. So we need to tell a more complicated story about this, and if we do that, some of your worries are less troublesome, right? And then there's a second point related to the first point, which I think is really interesting as well. Namely, look, if we do not tolerate these forms of conscientious conviction, this is bad for our shared, political and social life. In Hegel's terms, you're not going to get the right kind of ethical life. The costs are too high for our common existence. So I think you have a lot there, you know, on your side going against him. But I still think, I mean, his response, again, very quickly, running crudely, might look like this. He might say, nonetheless, you're still downplaying the ways in which we owe deference to what he calls ethical life. You're still downplaying the deference we owe to the state and the law. And the way you're doing this is you seem to reduce the very complicated story we have to tell about political institutions, including the law, to what you call the rule book. I mean, there's a kind of, when I hear you and I read your book, I think you do this sometimes, it's a kind of, I don't want to say it's a caricature, I think it's there, but it's a kind of notion of rigid rule following. That's your target. And Hegel would say, you know, and we could argue about this, he'd say, look, there's much more going on there, morally, ethically, politically. And that's why we owe deference in general to that in a way that you're still not acknowledging. I mean, we have to update this argument in appropriately democratic ways and liberal ways, but, you know, that's right. I mean, so that's similar to Robin's final point, I think. So I don't know if this is helpful, but I guess I want more of a story. I mean, I think there is more of a story about, you know, why, again, in general, following the law in not in any community, perhaps not even in any existing political community, right? But in some robust, idealized form. You know,
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really interesting. You're absolutely right. There's more than the rule book. I think what our responsibilities are as citizens will be to know the law better than we do, to facilitate its development, and to try to make it as reasonably just as possible. But I would also want to say that that the deference can be as interesting as the disobedience. There's a paper that's forthcoming in the Columbia Law Review. I don't know who the author is, but I know it's forthcoming, so I can talk about it. It's called Uncivil Obedience, and I don't know if the author's here, but in it the person argues that through ironically, laboriously, painstakingly, hair-splittingly following the law, you can be very destructive, well, not destructive, but disruptive. You can, so the example that the paper starts with is in California. Francis probably knows this. A few years ago, there was a group of motorists who went on the highway and deliberately followed the speed limit. It was at 55 miles an hour, and drove people crazy. That you don't do that, and but made a big point in following exactly what the law requested. And the paper goes through hundreds of examples of this, and you really get a sense that that the deference can be as strategic and as disruptive to ethical life or sort of our best support for our system as the disobedience.
Then labor unions is a specific kind of strike, which is working to
right,
following the laws.
exactly.
David.
Right. Just two things. One really short, one a little bit longer. I'm interested in if you could say more about what you think tolerance comes to in practice. And specifically, I suppose, the distinction is whether you think tolerance ought to be exculpating or merely merciful. Now, with regard to conviction, I suppose I wondered whether this was a very good account, or whether it captured the right sense of conviction. And the example that I had in mind was Deep Throat from the Watergate scandal. So there it seems to me that he would be unlikely to meet a lot of your tests. But the reason why it's still right to call conscientious objection or conviction, as you use the term, is because of what he risked.
Right.
So the conviction is expressed in the risk he's willing to take. However, I'm not at all clear that we could have applied criteria around dialogic effort, universal judgment, certainly not non-evasion. And it's not clear that even something, this applies to the other, first two that I said would be problematic, something like consistency. I just worry about saying, if X is consistent, and what that just comes to is, if X had been in another such situation, he would have done the same thing.
Right.
And famously, Dummett did a lot with sort wondering about how much of a, roughly speaking, what are the truth conditions for saying such so-and-so actually has this property of being consistent when they're never actually called upon to be consistent. So here it seems to be a case where I have the sense that your notion of conviction is much closer to something like epistemic conviction. It's like the sorts of things that convince us of our beliefs. That seems to me lopsided in the cases of conscientious objection, where action is really called for.
Right. Okay. So, with respect to tolerance, whether it's exculpating or merciful, so I do want to draw on both of those options. So I think that it should be possible to give a legal excuse based on the demands of conviction. And the arguments, relate to the ones I outlined, that respect for you as an autonomous, expressive, thinking, feeling being does not mean simply making some space for you privately or covertly to step out of line, but indeed, being an expressive being, you want to be seen to stand up for your views. So in my view, civil disobedience has the best claims, or better claims than private conscientious objection to whatever space we want to make for conscientious disobedience. So I think that legal excuse should be available, even if you're mistaken in your beliefs. And then I think sort of the idea of mercy has to come in later, sort of when sort of other features around your disobedience, things turn out less well than we might hope. So even if you're restrained in your action, but it does damage, it does harm to people, there's a reason to sort of formally censure the behavior, to say as a society we condemn this disobedience, that then to be merciful on this, again on the strength that an appreciation that it's onerous to ask of you to follow the law, to put conformity first ahead of personal conviction. So those are very rough thoughts, but I think there's scope for both. On conviction and deep throat, my first thought would be that it's diachronic. So, it's not simply, you engage in one self-exposing act. Like Edward Snowden, it sort of took him a week. He sort of, all this information came out, and then a week later, and in his case, he got in front of the story doing that. He limited what the U.S. could do to him. There were good reasons, probably as much strategic as moral for being self-exposing. In the case of Mark Felt, I think it's, the value of what he was able to do, depended on, for a very long time not exposing himself. And I think what, the dialogic effort is about ultimately, yes, being. I don't want to be too simplistic about what it means to stand up and be willing to be seen. I think that being willing to bear the risks, and maybe the risks are very great for that kind of revelation. So even if it's secretive or initially not self-exposing, the risk that comes with doing that kind of work sort of compensates for the fact you're not standing up to be seen in a transparent way. With respect to the lopsidedness of my notion of conviction, that it takes action. I hope I'd like to think I've built that in, but the way I'm understanding consistency, you're right. If you're never confronted with an opportunity to be pressed, to have to stand up for your view, then it's hard to credit how much you are committed to this. But in a way, you're lucky. If your deepest convictions are amongst those best honored in your society, and you don't have to be the dissenter, then we don't have to doubt your sincerity or your commitment. You just you're not put in the awkward or the difficult position of having to dissent. The way I've understood consistency is it does, I think, unfortunately, come out with the result that we can only have one overriding commitment at a time. There's sort of one overmastering passion. Or I don't want to use passion because it is rationalistic, but what you're willing to do, that is the test, and you have to meet some logical and evidential tests for your conviction to be taken seriously. So I think there is an important epistemic dimension. Otherwise, we can't make sense of what it is you say you're committed to. What is it you're asking us to tolerate? It has to be internally coherent. It has to be vaguely, evidentially satisfactory. Otherwise, there's nothing to say that you're being committed to.
My point about consistency goes for dialogic effort and universal judgment. In other words, you may never make such a universal judgment. You may never engage in dialogic effort. And then it looks like the satisfaction of those criteria just comes down to the claim, if so-and-so had been in such a situation,
They
he would have
would
done
have.
such and such.
Right.
So that at least leaves open the question of how your criteria is supposed to operate. If we're supposed to say, so I want to say I can identify deep throat as a case of moral conviction. And it seems to me I ought to be epistemically pretty neutral about these 3 points at least. The non-evasive one, I see there's a story to be told there perhaps.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, despite being absolutely epistemically neutral, I'm not in any way epistemically neutral about his having conviction and it being a conscientious conviction.
I think he did make a dialogic effort, and I think he did. He obviously thought what he was trying to address was morally wrong. So I don't see those conditions as not being met in his case.
Okay, suppose it's a hypothetical case where he didn't.
Okay, so he didn't think there was anything wrong in the activities he was exposing.
He never made a judgment.
Okay, he was
a
a bit whimsical.
Not that there's anything whimsical about that.
Right.
Judgment is a specific act let's put a mental act, an act of the will, however you want to characterize it. He never came to make that act. It seems to me eminently plausible for very many people motivated by conscience.
Right.
You might be right to say that had they been asked to make that judgment,
Right.
they would have done so. You could even be right to say their judgment about what they should do entails this other judgment.
Yeah.
You have a story to tell about that.
Right.
The judgment itself would not have been made.
Okay, so it sounds like, to you it sounds like it's an over-intellectualized project that one has to...
I'm just trying to know how your criteria apply.
Yeah, I would want to make room for the intuition, that the person who, they can't articulate to themselves, or someone has to give them the language to explain why they have to do this, but they are animated by a belief about morality. And I don't think you need to unpack it much more than that just there's this is wrong, I have to do something about this.
Okay, now I'm conscious of the time here. We've got 8 more minutes. We've got 6 people on my list. We're probably not
So
going to reach everybody.
I'll
but
say less.
I will ask you to, if you can, keep your questions briefer. May.
I was going to be very brief, but I don't think you can say, I don't see how you can say what you've just said to David consistently, because surely the kind of feeling that something, the sort of the gut feeling of this moral intuition isn't a conviction. That's the whole point about it, isn't it? I mean, it's just if it's a conviction, it must involve some kind of judgment. And I would have thought you want to rule out the people who feel, impelled to do something,
but can't make a reasoned case.
So I mean, that's just by the way. The other, a very just picking up on what I have a little question, but picking up on what Robin's example of migrants and illegal migrants and Bill's response, and your own example of the Australian official who used delaying tactics and sent a signal more or less to say that she didn't think that the way in which the laws were constructed or whatever, or maybe being implemented were good ones. It does seem to me to make a difference as to how the Australian official could be interpreted as acknowledging the unsatisfactory nature of the law as it stands, but also seeing the need for improvement just in the short term. Something has to be done. Whereas, I mean, this is just based on anecdotal evidence and newspaper reading, but it seems to, at the moment, from my impression, what's going on at the moment in the south of Italy, for example, is that a lot of illegal immigrants are being, not documented. They're being, eyes are being shut and people are being passed on, but they're being passed on to other countries because the Italians don't want to have to deal with the problem. So, and that seems to be quite a different case. I mean, why you shut your eyes and your attitude to the law, it seems to me relevant, and that's just in the spirit of, I think, your answer and what Bill was saying. My question was really why, and it's a small question.
I like your definition of conscience in terms of ethical sensibility and so on. I mean, you've a rich conception of conscience. I like the direction in which you approach conscience. But why couldn't conscience be the voice of God? I mean, surely for some people it is the voice of God. The problem only arises when they say, well, I hear the voice of God, and I hear it better than I hear it better than anybody else, and I speak it better than anybody else. Surely that's the problem, not, the source of conscience doesn't really matter.
Okay, thank you. Very, very briefly on your first point to my response to David. I think, for me, Edward Snowden is a good case, that he had a strong sense that these programs are wrong, they need to be exposed, there has to be a debate. But in listening to the initial interviews with him, he did a terrible job of making the case for why this was such a big deal. There's sort of hand-wavy references to privacy, and he just thought, here's your chance. Don't make it who's Edward. He didn't make it who's Edward Snowden because there wasn't more meat there in his attempts to initiate a dialogue. I think obviously other people had interest in making it all about him, but I think so. Those two. Well, yes, the best version of satisfying the dialogic effort condition would be someone who can not just know that she thinks this is compelling enough that it deserves a reasoned case, but that she can make it. That would be the best case. But I think I would hope anyway that the two conditions can coincide. You can want a dialogic debate even if you're not the best place to make it. With respect to God, I may have done God a disservice. My thought was that what God would be giving to someone who claimed to hear the voice of God would be infallible moral guidance. It wouldn't be sensitive to complexity and plurality and the fact that that this value might be privileged and that one. I had an image that God wouldn't be part of a tragic morality, but that might be wrong.
I might be wrong. Yeah.
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 Thanks.
Maybe group some questions together. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just if I got correct earlier in the presentation, that there was a distinction between the phenomenon of someone believing that they were in good conscience wouldn't necessarily mean they were that it was a moral fact, and that there were genuine moral responsibilities. And then I wondered, when you mentioned that there's an onus on the state, or there's the responsibility of the state to have minimal moral burden on its officials. So lethal injections were introduced to alleviate the sense of the burden of responsibility as a non-violent or and then firing squad generally you don't know who shot or whatever. So there seems to be tension there, because on the one hand it's a matter of, with the genuine moral responsibilities, that it's actually a matter of the weight on the soul, as it were, even figuratively speaking. And on the other hand, it's the burden on the actual subjective consciousness, which is effectively alleviated by lethal injection. And so that seemed a little to be a contradiction almost.
Yeah, and I
which
think
isn't that one should be minimized.
Right. No. I think it's sort of taking advantage of some of our psychological defaults to say, well, if you're just pushing a button, if you don't see what's happening, then you do have to do some imaginative work to know, what's been done. But I don't think that actually diminishes the moral burden. You're still, if the way we executed was just pushing a button and you didn't see what happened, that's still a very morally demanding job, even if psychologically you don't feel it as much as you would if you were, electrifying someone.
It is a burden not necessarily experienced.
That's right.
Okay, Keith.
Just to follow on from that, I was fascinated by your, and I loved your paper, and I thought it was Rawls, but far more sophisticated than Rawls in many ways. You introduced the term overly morally burdensome offices, and you use this term in relation to somebody who acts as a purveyor of noxious substances for execution of people. Why is it overly morally burdensome? Because immediately after that you introduced Jeff McMahon and the image of the soldier. I initially thought, okay, this is morally burdensome because it involves killing, and some people don't like killing.
Yeah.
And then you come to the soldier. Why is the soldier's office not morally burdensome? Because
That is equally.
that's killing.
Yeah.
Whether it's just or unjust, it's still killing.
Yeah.
So is it because it's demanding supererogatory act on the part of certain people,
Yeah.
which makes the office overly morally burdensome, or is it really it's unjust?
Unjust.
It's an unjust office,
Yeah.
and it shouldn't exist as an office.
Yeah.
So, which
Yeah.
is it?
Yeah. Right. No, thank you. That's a really nice question, and I think it shows I haven't thought this through very well. So. I made an assumption that I'm only just appreciating that someone who would be fit to perform that role or that office would have to have a degree of medical training, and that gives you certain moral responsibilities toward people in terms of caring and healing, and So I saw in my mind that this was actually still a doctor who just, your function is to oversee executions. In the same way, some doctors, almost your function now is to provide abortions because other people won't do it. This very difficult, emotionally difficult work. That's so sort of within a just practice of trying to be accommodating to people. You can have injustices if someone's job is always to pick up the morally difficult task. So not to say that executions are, but with respect to abortion. So I think I probably want to say both things. That the analogy with soldiers is a good one. Soldiers, I would guess I'd have to say that it's a necessary evil. We think that we have to have a defensive system. We need to have the capacity for humanitarian intervention. It's not we'd love to be like Costa Rica and not to have a military, but we do, and so while it's a very morally burdensome job, it's sort of the least worst thing we can have. The thought would be if we need to have a defensive system. When we're talking about criminal justice, do we need to be using what's deemed the harshest punishment in order to?
So it comes down into substantive, moral judgment.
I think so. Yeah. Sort of. We have to have certain kinds of offices to deal with certain kinds of big problems. How big the problems are will depend on the circumstances and resources. But I think we've got, That's one.
Okay, time for one more, and it's Eileen, and apologies to Anita and Martin.
You don't want to maybe just if people just ask the questions so they're out in the public space, and then
Okay, so Eileen and Anita and Martin.
and then you can just say one line.
Or we can have lunch. We can chat over lunch. Yeah.
Thanks. My question, first of all, it goes back to your discussion of problems associated with intolerance of conscientious non-conformity. So I'm quickly looking at a picture of a professional who feels unable to deliver a particular service, students, patients, whatever, at a disadvantage because of that, and their rights are protected because somebody else comes in and provides the service. So I just want to look at how that happens. The institution, it seems to me, doesn't work. So justice is delivered at the institutional level. Now my question is about who manages or who operates the system. Are these persons, and if they're persons, do they too have a right to conscientious objection? If that were to happen, that's something to regress. We won't allow that. We have justice delivered by people who have no conscience. And
that's a nice problem. Yeah, that's nice.
My question had to do with the kind of role of strategy in conscientious acts, because I guess there was just a sense for me in some of your responses that actually it plays a greater role than it seemed to at first in your talk. I'm specifically thinking of when you talked about like the religious examples in your answer to Francis's question in the beginning, that you were saying, okay, some group who is doing something out of self-preservation rather than just out of a kind of sense that this is morally what they should be doing, then we doubt their sincerity. And yet I think I question that we can separate strategy so much from conscientious acts, because there's also a sense of a structural understanding that comes through an appreciation of strategy, which I think is kind of lacking if we then separate the two so much as I think sometimes it seems that you were doing. So that was the question. Briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, on the distinction between conviction and conscience. and I'm not sure whether I picked you up right. It seemed to me that you were favouring the conscience thing, which is a more free-floating thing that is responsive to the situational thing that is given, whereas the conviction thing is something that is stuck somewhere on some level. And I was just wondering, isn't conviction in a way the result through time of a trajectory of conscientious decision making, that you end up at some stage to have certain things that you just learned,
Right.
and okay, you're still open. So.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I might as well say one word. So indirect. My answer would be indirectness. How close is the supervisor's decision? You might one might sort of go as far back. I can't be part of a government that is overseeing an institution that has these. So. I think you might be able to go up one level in the food chain and say, okay, the supervisor, like Mark Stern, might say, I cannot oversee my staff, providing this service. But if you get too far away, it makes less sense to insist on nonconformity. With respect to strategy, I think you're right, and I haven't got a good story about how the relation between strategic considerations and moral ones. But yeah, no, I think I shouldn't have pulled them apart. In my view, conscience requires conviction. You have to start by meeting the tests for conscientious conviction, and then, with luck, your conviction is morally well founded, and you can assert that it's a matter of conscience.
Okay, so thank you very much.